It's time
for 15 minutes of non-stop MMA, tackling the biggest news in the sport. Head into the chat and let us know how you feel. Live from Fredericton, New Brunswick, Canada, here's your host, Craig Allen.
All right, and with that, we are back and we are live. And hey, we've got some MMA to get excited about. So, like I said, over on the side and in the chat, be sure to get into the chat. You're going to direct this show, but we've got a lot to cover today. As you can see, the topics next to me. UFC 249 update. Is it going to be UFC 249? Is it going to be UFC 250 coming up shortly? Who knows? I don't know. I don't have those powers, but we're going to get a little bit of clarity from Brett Okamoto. Have a look at some of the tweets that he's put out there. In terms of the card that we can expect coming up on May 9th, that's what it's looking like. Of course, April 18th, we were all expecting UFC 249. We've got that canceled. No Fight Island, no Tachi Palace, but maybe it's going to be from the UFC Apex, from Fight Island. Who knows? But we're going to touch on those, as well as MMA Going Forward, maybe some of the fights that are booked coming up shortly. But really appreciate everybody for tuning in. Like I said, make sure you check out that chat over there and let me know what you're thinking. But in terms of MMA coming up, as always, you can find us on Twitter and Instagram at Craig Allen FMP, at Fight Night Picks. You saw what we had come out, what was it, last Wednesday, if I'm not mistaken. We had UFC 249 predictions for the card. Tony and Justin, no Habib, which was kind of a shame. And that's the way that things are shaping up for May 9th. But we had Tony and Justin Gaethje. We had Rosenstrike and Ngannou. All sorts of great fights coming up, or that we were supposed to get for April 18th. And of course, we don't have those fights. You had the governor of California stepping in, really kind of not interfering, but at least having his voice heard, and ESPN and ABC kind of squashing that card. Now, you can go out there, blame MMA media. I certainly wouldn't agree with you being part of the MMA media sphere, but you got to look at it through a couple of different lenses. You might not agree with what certain MMA media members are doing, and listen, that's fair. You're entitled to your own opinion. But at the same time, it's one of those things where I'm dependent on the fights. Like, there's no Fight Night Picks without fights. So it's kind of a weird situation that everybody's in right now. You have to look out for, fighter safety. And it's not just fighter safety. It's their family. It's their community. It's their coaches. It's their gym. It's everybody involved. So you have to look at it through those different lenses. But UFC 249, in terms of an update, it looks like we're going to have fights on May 9th. Now, I know, again, Brett Okamoto, he's been the one that's kind of had Dana's ear and vice versa during this entire situation. But some of the fights that have been announced, and they were thrown out there by Brett Okamoto yesterday. Donald Cerrone, Anthony Pettis was kind of that fight that was thrown out there, and a lot of people didn't see it coming. It's supposed to be at 170 pounds, which is awesome to see. I know that was one of the ones that was added in there. Henry Cejudo originally supposed to be taking on Jose Aldo at UFC 250. Aldo and a lot of Brazilian fighters not able to make it to the States, not able to get visas to fight. So in steps Dominic Cruz. Do you agree with that one? I know Oliver Sell, if you're tuning in, you're typically on a lot of these live chats. Big into the the lower weight classes, and 135, 145, 155, even 125. Really exciting divisions right now. But in terms of a Jose Aldo fight with Henry Cejudo, I get it, and I think realistically Jose Aldo, gives Henry Cejudo a lot more fits than maybe a Marlon Moraes, and at least we've already gotten that look. But to me, man, you lose 2 fights in a row, you lose to Volkanovski, and then you lose to Marlon Moraes when you make your debut at 135. Listen, it was a really close fight, and I know we're splitting hairs as to whether or not, Aldo won, Moraes won, but still, at the end of the day, it's a loss, and it's 2 in a row going into a title shot. Was I totally on board with Yoel Romero taking on Israel Adesanya? Maybe not. No, I wasn't, but still, the fight took place. It was pretty boring. I think a fight between Aldo and Cejudo would be a lot more interesting, of course, but still, now you're getting Dominic Cruz, which is a totally different look because you haven't seen Dominic Cruz in the cage, in the octagon, in a professional setting since 2016 against Cody Garbrandt. So it's been a long time since we've seen Dominic Cruz back to the cage. And again, that's one of those guys that he's arguably the GOAT at 135 pounds. You'd be hard-pressed to find a better GOAT at 135 pounds. I mean, TJ Dillashaw, Uriah Faber, like, who are you going to say? Who's the greatest of all time at 135 pounds? it's tough to say, but I'd probably say that Dominic Cruz is that guy. So does that merit a title shot after that much time off, plus coming in off loss? I don't really think so, but looks like that fight's going to happen either way. But like I said, from Brett Okamoto, on that card, coming up on May 9th, UFC, if whether or not it's 249, whether or not it's 250, again, that's all open to interpretation. If you go over on Tapology right now, it's considered UFC 250. But let's go through the matchups. Charles Rosa, Bryce Mitchell, Nico Price, Vicente Luque, Jacare Souza taking on Uriah Hall, Carlos Esparza, Michelle Watterson, another one that's kind of popped up here. Jorgen Castro still taking on Greg Hardy. Donald Cerrone, Anthony Pettis, another one of those ones that was added in. Fabrizio Verdum, Alexei Olenek. You've got Jeremy Stevens, Calvin Kattar, which is an awesome fight. And I could go on and on all day about that fight. It's so much fun. You've got Francis Ngannou taking on Jairzinho Rozenstruik. Amanda Nunes, Felicia Spencer for the 145-pound belt. You get your Canadian on the card and Felicia Spencer. Dominic Cruz taking on Henry Cejudo, and Tony Ferguson, Justin Gaethje. Now, again, all those fights, rumored fights, we'll see what happens. But hey, we've got some fights to get excited about. And I know one of these things that some people have asked us, and like I said, you can reach out if you'd like on Twitter and Instagram, at Craig Allen FNP, at Fight Night Picks, and again, you can find Matt at Matt Allen FNP. But one of the things that a lot of people that have reached out to us have said is, are you going to make the picks? Are you going to make the picks? And it was one of those things with the UFC 249. We did the picks, and they were good for about a day, and then the card was canceled. So with UFC, again, whether or not this is UFC 249 or UFC 250, we'll have prediction videos out there. And again, with the last bit of the videos that we did, we ended up Skyping them and split screening it. A little bit different, but you got to account for the social distancing here. But let me know what you're thinking about some of these bookings. I mean, some of the ones that I threw out there, Amanda Nunes, Felicia Spencer, that was kind of one of those ones that was going to happen anyway. Now you get here, you get 3 title fights. You've got your women's featherweight title, your men's bantamweight, and then your men's interim lightweight title. And I listened to the Joe Rogan Experience, the MMA show with Brendan Schaub, and they kept talking about Khabib and the winner of Ferguson Gaethje. I agree with those guys. If you didn't get the chance to listen to it, they were kind of looking at a fight between the winner and Khabib to take place later on in the summer. I think that makes a lot of sense too, just as long as things work out logistically. I mean, that's another one of those things. And we'll move into the next topic. Fight Island and the UFC Apex. I mean, I know it's not going to happen. It's not going to happen on Fight Island. And now, of course, Dana White's come out and said, and I'm looking at an article right now from the MMA Junkie that says Dana White, UFC Apex to host live events starting next month and for the foreseeable future. Now, for me, I thought that the UFC was going to get into it in Florida. I mean, you know, we've seen a lot of different news from WWE, loosely connected XFL. Their whole season was canceled, and then the organization filed for bankruptcy. That's kind of like your B League football. But then today, lots of roster cuts, and you know the UFC doesn't want to do that. They want to keep fights going, and it's one of those things that they've really been trying for. It seems as if the fights are going to take place at the Apex, which is good because, again, you won't have the fans involved and you can actually have it behind closed doors. And I know in the States, that's kind of been the conversation that's been going on there. Now, if I can get into the chat, TTMNNN says, do you think Anshe Delia is the greatest heavyweight prospect outside of the UFC? That's a really good question. And there's a lot of great prospects outside of the UFC. It's one of those things that Matt and I have been working on for a video coming up. I know with that Perry Encounter series, we've been getting into a lot of your questions. That's one of those ones that I can definitely address here. There's a lot of names, again, like I said, that come up. And in terms of heavyweight prospects, we've seen a lot of them pop up in the UFC lately. I'm talking the Cyril Gons, who I truly do believe he could become a champion in the next 2 to 3 years. It all depends how that top half of the division shakes out, because the Stipe DC logjam, you got Francis Ngannou that keeps winning fights, you got Curtis Blades that continues to win fights except for the fights against Francis Ngannou, and then you still have those guys that stick around, like the Verdum, who's off of his USADA suspension, you've got Alistair Overeem, you got Alexander Volkov, so there's a lot of guys up there. But there are certainly prospects that we've seen come out, and I know this isn't really a hot take, but you look at Greg Hardy. I think he has a pretty decent shot at least sticking around in the promotion for some time. But if we're looking at a guy whose nickname is, and it's a great one, is Walking Trouble, Anshe Delia, I know that I've watched some of his fights previously, especially the KSW fight against Ole Thompson. Big win there against a recognizable name. Of course, he fought Mersin Tabor back in 2015. And then he took quite a bit of time off. And that's one of those things where you wonder how that's going to affect a fighter. And again, some of those names like you had brought up with Anshe Delia, you bring up Rico Rodriguez. And I remember there was a Delia fight. It was back in 2014. I'm looking up his record right now. It was the North-South choke. That was kind of crazy. Croatian fighter. And one of those guys that at 6'5" with a 79-inch reach advantage, or just reach in general, is one of those guys that if he were to enter into the UFC, I think he could certainly have an immediate impact. Like I said, since he took that time off, beat Ricardo Prezel, who was 9-0 at the time in Ryzen, beat another fighter in PFL. So he's bounced around a little bit, but if he could finally find a home and at least get active, great question. Do I think he's the greatest heavyweight prospect outside of the UFC? He's knocking on the door right now because, again, you're talking about a lot of fighters that have come in, the likes of Augusto Sakai. I mean, yeah, he was in Bellator, and he found some success there. I don't know if I go with prospect, but him, Cyril Gahn, Sergey Pavlovich that was with Fight Nights Global, now he's with the UFC, another big name. But in terms of guys that are outside of the UFC, I think you're right. I mean, maybe Ali Asayev at 9-0 that was able to win the last season of the PFL at heavyweight. So great question there, and keep the questions coming. Now, like I said, in terms of the fights that we have coming up, lots of great bookings. If we were looking at UFC 249 in terms of our fight predictions, the one for me that stuck out as a fight of the night, and yeah, that heavyweight rumble between Francis Ngannou and Jairzinho Rozenstruik was a great one. And again, it was such a head scratcher as to why it was, the curtain jerker on the prelims. Yeah, it's one of those ones that ESPN's probably going to want to put out there to get people excited about paying for the pay-per-view in a tough time where people are having a hard time paying for anything. So I get why they're keeping that there. Hopefully it's on the main card, I guess I'll say, for this event coming up on the 9th. But for me, the fight of the night, Jeremy Stephens and Calvin Kattar and Donald Cerrone and Anthony Showtime Pettis are neck and neck. I'm still going to go with Stephens and Kattar. I know a lot of people were sending around the highlight clip. If you want to call it a highlight, some people might call it a low light. Jeremy Stephens when he fought Josh Emmett and threw those extra couple of elbows at the end. I mean, did the referee end the fight yet? No, he didn't, but still, it was a tough look. And for poor Josh Emmett, I mean, that's how you can end careers that way. But we've been able to see Josh Emmett back out healthy now. In terms of Jeremy Stephens, he's one of those fighters that you win or you lose, people are still interested. And for Jeremy Stephens, too, he's at this point in his career where he's not winning a ton of fights. I mean, he's lost to Aldo, Zabit Magomed Sharipov. He had the no contest against Yair Rodriguez with the eye gouge, and then a loss to Yair Rodriguez. Whereas Calvin Kattar, yeah, he lost his last fight, but before that, plenty of success. I mean, since he's been in the UFC, his only losses are to Renato Moicano and Zabit Magomed Sharipov, and the wins are really what stand out. We're talking about Andre Fili, Shane Burgos, which, again, that's a fight that was like for like, striker for striker. And Calvin Kattar looked amazing, plus he was performing at home in Boston, so great performance there. Lost to Moicano. He got outclassed in that fight at UFC 223, but wins over Chris Fishgold, former Cage Warriors champ, and Ricardo Lamas put him to this point right now that he had that sketchy fight against Zabit that was supposed to be in Boston. That was on the same card as Chris Weidman and Dominic Reyes. They moved it to Russia to make it a main event. It was a 3-round main event. And of course, Zabit gets the win, but again, it's one of those fights similar to Jose Aldo when he took on Marlon Moraes. It's weird. It's weird because a lot of people thought Aldo won, and in the same breath, and I've seen arguments on Twitter about this fight, and I've seen arguments in our comments, so I just want to put this one out there. If you watch that fight between Calvin Kattar and Zabit Magomed Sharipov, Calvin Kattar, to me, definitely won the third round, 100%. The second round was contentious, but one of the judges scored it for Calvin Kattar. The weird thing is, that same judge scored the third round for Zabit. So what's what? I mean, a couple of people threw it out there in the comments and said, oh, well, Zabit had higher striking totals. He won the fight. But that's not always the case. And you know that, and if you're tuning into Fight Night Picks, you probably know that. But 1-1 doesn't always make 2 in MMA. you see a lot of different people, even commenters, they'll talk about advancing and those type of statistics. They don't really mean a whole lot. Top control sometimes doesn't really mean a whole lot. You kind of have to paint a full picture, and that's how fights normally should be judged. But again, in that fight between Kattar and Magomed Sharipov, yeah, there was a lot left to be desired, probably by both guys, but you saw a strong showing near the end from Kattar, going over to Russia, taking on the Russian fighter in Magomed Sharipov. And I'd say he passed that test with flying colors. I mean, Zabit is one of the top prospects in MMA, if you still want to call him a top prospect, because he's highly rated in the UFC's featherweight division with big wins. But nonetheless, that would be my fight of the night for that card. Kattar and Stevens, hopefully it could deliver. And of course, your main event too. I mean, Justin Gaethje taking on probably one of the toughest tests, but it's just tough test after tough test for Gaethje in taking on Tony Ferguson. And it's kind of crazy too that fight's even happening. It's really, really weird that they're putting together Tony Ferguson, Justin Gaethje for the second time, if you want to call it that. When you've had 5 opportunities to make Khabib and Tony Ferguson, why don't you just sit on your hands, wait for that fight? Because you're taking such a big risk, matching Tony Ferguson up against Justin Gaethje. Do I think Ferguson wins the fight? I do think he wins the fight, but yeah, that's a tough one. And Matt and I have been talking about this a lot lately. Usually technical strikers that have even just a little bit of power will beat the brawlers. It usually happens. But in MMA, anything can happen, and you'll see brawlers win fights fairly often. So Justin Gaethje, Tony Ferguson, it's one of those wild ones that if Ferguson loses, we might never get to see Khabib and Tony. Now, the questions over there. TT, M, and NN. You're saying it's maybe weird for me, but biggest fight on this card is Verdum and Oleinik. It's one of those crossroads fights. It really is. I mean, listen, Fabrizio Verdum back in Strikeforce when he ended Fedor's 10-year run. I mean, there was that one fight where he grabbed the ropes. There was that one other fight that ended in a no contest against Big Nog, if I'm not mistaken, over in Pride. But still, Fabrizio Verdum to get that armbar, he had the triangle locked up and then finished him with the armbar. That was crazy. Fabrizio Verdum, to me, I hold in high regard. It's a shame that he had that USADA suspension. It really is. But you rarely see such crisp jiu-jitsu at 265 pounds. I mean, it's just crazy, the fact that Verdum can do what he does at the weight class that he's at. The other thing, too, you go back to Verdum when he took on Stipe Miocic, and that was one of those fights that it seemed pretty cool and calm. It was in Brazil. Verdum was the champ. He just won the belt, and Stipe absolutely flatlined him in the first round. Knocked him cold, said, "I'm the best, I'm the champ," and it was a weird scene. But Verdum after that was able to somehow work his way back up through the division. And I remember when he took on Alexander Volkov, and I thought, man, way to go for Fabrizio Verdum. If he's able to beat Volkov, he's knocking on that door for a title shot. And yeah, I mean, Volkov flatlined Verdum and just absolutely pummeled him. So Fabrizio Verdum now coming back off of this long layoff, taking on a guy in Alexei Oleinik who, realistically, I mean, Oleinik was on kind of one of those weird runs too. You look at his overall record right now, he's 58-13-1. So that's crazy. Getting into the comments, Tommaso Mark, thanks for tuning in. Yeah, it's been a long time since we've seen you. So listen, you're on your way to work. Good luck there, and really appreciate all the hard work that everybody's doing out there, especially in these times. But we're talking about Alexei Oleinik, and at this point, I mean, he had the loss against Blades where that was kind of a sketchy one. Then he beat Junior Albini by Ezekiel choke. He beat Mark Hunt by rear naked choke. Then he lost to Alistair Overeem, got finished. Then he got finished by Walt Harris. And then he beat Maurice Green at UFC 246 back in January. So he's back in the win column. And it's one of those ones, like you said, you're excited about the fight. You got 2 really high-level jiu-jitsu specialists there, and that is an exciting fight and not something that you always see at 265 pounds. So really good choice there. Josh Talks UFC saying, why are people complaining about the UFC putting on events? When will it be okay or put on events? We're just going to wait 2 years without sports. It's a tough one. It's a really tough one. Let's get into MMA going forward. It's tough to tell what's going to happen. I know in Florida, and I pulled the article up from USA Today, But the governor of Florida said that sports, and I guess the word here is Florida's declared professional sports league employees and their media partners essential services. Now they still have in Florida a shelter-in-place order. They put it out there on April 3rd, and it says here that it's going to expire April 30th at the earliest. But Florida's opening the doors right now to not just MMA. You still have WWE going on there, but also baseball. I mean, who knows what's going to happen with baseball? Who knows what's going to happen with all the other sports? But baseball in particular, a warm weather sport that you have to have outside. Maybe end up with soccer as well. But Josh talks UFC. I mean, you'll watch some fight in Dana White's backyard with Disney's permission, of course. Yeah, it'd be crazy if we could have that. But I don't know what's going to happen. We're still going to be covering the sport. And I know one of those things, we put out a video yesterday that actually, I'm really proud of it. We put out a video called, in case you missed it, MMA Legends, Lyoto Machida, and spent a ton of time editing this, but I think it's awesome. It's a masterclass because you get to see the inner workings, the career, the rise, where these fighters are now, and Josh Talks UFC, appreciate you too as well. But the rise of Lyoto Machida, in his career, it was so weird because I remember, and this is one of these stories that Matt and I will tell, when we get into MMA, it was during Lyoto Machida's prime. It was 2008, 2009, and for Machida, he was champ from 2009 to 2010 when he beat Rashad Evans and then Shogun, and then he obviously had the loss to Shogun and kind of built his way back up, but not really at light heavyweight, but back at middleweight. So it's one of those things where John Franklin, who's another one of our hosts that gladly just joined us, and I have hosted a show with him called Early Stoppage, you can find here too. But he goes through his entire career. He does a lot of tape study and a lot of different things live on screen. So make sure you check that one out as we continue on in the comments. Listen, is it too soon for Till to face Whitaker? It seems too fast for him to face former champ. Yeah, that's one of those ones that, I know Matt's pretty hot and heavy on that, just based on the fact that Darren Till at welterweight, they built him up so quick. He went from having a draw against Nicholas Dalby in as close of a fight as you're going to see to just continuing to push. And yeah, he was able to have really good performances, but after he lost to Tyron Woodley, it seemed like the bottom just totally fell out and Darren Till wasn't going to be able to build himself back up again. For me, the fight at middleweight that really showed me that if Darren Till can swing it at middleweight, you got to take on a guy like Kelvin Gastelum, and he passed that test for me. I know a lot of people are going to say that was a boring fight, but I thought Darren Till performed quite well, and Kelvin Gastelum is one of those guys, if Till get knocked out by Jorge Masvidal at 170 pounds, then at 185 pounds, you're going to face a guy who can fight in southpaw quite easily, can get into the pocket, one of those tough looks that you're not going to see for a really long time. Kelvin Gastelum is that guy. He's that guy that's going to engage. And yeah, their fight didn't totally go that way. But still, Jay Calder 15 said, the fact that Till beat Gastelum instantly puts him up there, I think so as well. And I think Till and Whitaker is such a big fight again, it's one of those weird divisions, 185. You could say that Jared Cannonier deserves a title shot, and I would not argue with that whatsoever. I think Cannonier deserves a title shot. I thought Jack Hermanson was on a huge run, and he beat Hermanson, so hey, Jared Cannonier. And yeah, I mean, you could argue the Anderson Silva fight, but still, he won the fight. Continuing on, Josh Talks UFC going back up. If Cruz came back and beat Cejudo, would it be a better comeback than GSP? Yeah, that's tough. I mean, for me, GSP took so much time off, and it wasn't injury related necessarily, and who's to say what it was. And a great conversation that he had yesterday with Ariel Helwani, if you get a chance to check that one out with ESPN. I know I did, because again, we were talking about it, I get into fighting because of Lyoto Machida and Shogun Rua, but also because of GSP. I mean, again, the whole Canadian connection. GSP was so big up here in Canada, it was insane. I know he was such a big MMA star, but GSP for sure got me more and more into the sport. But I think if Dominic Cruz is able to win that fight against Henry Cejudo, yeah, you could certainly make a case. That's a huge comeback. If there's a comeback of the year award, if we're handing out Fight Night Picks Prediction Champ awards, then yeah, I think if that happens in 2020 and he gets a win, that would be huge. Josh Talks UFC also says, let's hope Cruz can come back and fight a good fight against Cejudo. For sure. The other thing there, Till versus Whitaker in the UK as a fight night would be great. The question I would ask you, what's the fight to make? I mean, are we going to get Leon Edwards versus Tyron Woodley that was originally booked for the fight night in London? Are we going to get Leon Edwards versus somebody else? Which, again, it's kind of a slight to Leon Edwards. He's on a huge streak right now, and you're talking wins that mean a lot. I thought his win against Gunnar Nelson, where he had to worry about karate and jiu-jitsu, and he was able to totally just put on a masterclass and snuff out anything that Gunnar Nelson was able to bring forward or bring to the table. That was a great win for Leon Edwards. You know how good his boxing is. All of a sudden now he can wrestle too. That's one of those things that you're going to have to worry about if you're a guy facing Leon Edwards at 170. So that fight for me with Tyron Woodley, where you're taking on a power puncher and a guy that has great offensive and defensive wrestling in Woodley, one of those top guys out of Mizzou, a guy that's trained with Ben Askren for a long time. And listen, take that with a grain of salt if you want in terms of MMA, but still, Tyron Woodley was a champ for a decent chunk of time, and his losses are to pretty darn good fighters. So realistically for me, Woodley and the fight against Leon Edwards is the fight that I would want to make. And yeah, there's more smoke and there's a better show if you have Woodley and Covington, but still, I think that's the fight to make. And if you have a UK fight night, which again, knock on wood, can happen in 2020, I would want to have Till and Whitaker, and even if you could put Leon Edwards and Woodley. But again, Josh Talks UFC saying that you'd rather see Colby versus Woodley. That's a fight to make. Listen, where there's smoke, there's fire, and since Colby was interim champ after he beat Rafael dos Anjos and was supposed to fight Tyron Woodley at UFC 227, that one is a long time coming. So we get into the last half of the show, and actually it's the last fifth. Your fight night picks. You've been gracious enough to hit up the chat and let me know what you're thinking. Continue to do so. But again, there's lots of great fights coming up. I'm looking at the UFC's total slate of cards supposed to be coming up. You've got Overeem versus Harris that's supposed to come up on May 9th, or May 16th rather. Looking at these over on Tapology. They still have UFC 251 listed. You've got Moraes taking on Piotr Jan. That's supposed to be coming at you from Kazakhstan. You've also got Blades versus Volkov, which is it's slated for Saskatoon. I don't know if the UFC is going to end up going to Toontown in Canada, especially due to the fact that, they pretty much said that the Apex is going to be the exclusive home for the fights anytime soon. Jake Calder 15 saying if Leon gets screwed out of the Tyron Woodley fight, yeah, that's really tough. We're also getting, am I the only one that thinks Colby versus Chiesa would be entertaining in Portland? Michael Chiesa. Holy smokes. Like, I know Rafael dos Anjos, for me, he held a lot of water at 155 pounds when he was champ. It sucks that he broke his foot, couldn't fight Conor McGregor. That was that. But still, if you look at dos Anjos at 170, the telling win for me was the fight against Robbie Lawler. Like, you're talking Robbie Lawler that could easily fight at middleweight, taking on a smaller guy like dos Anjos. And dos Anjos looked great in that fight. But holy smokes. Like, dos Anjos right now, not looking that great. But Michael Chiesa, to his credit, I mean, how did he make 155 pounds? Like, how? I have no idea. It doesn't compute in my brain. Josh also saying Chiesa versus Gilbert Burns. That's a really good fight. I think Gilbert Burns is on more of a roll right now, especially with his last win over Demian Maia, which you're supposed to get a jiu-jitsu masterclass, and you had Gilbert Burns just looking phenomenal in that fight. And again, another guy that at 155 pounds, how did he make the weight? And now he's at 170 and he looks great. Just like Jorge Masvidal. Had a good time at 155 and absolutely owning at 170. Who's Masvidal going to fight next? That's a name that's definitely come up. And you're talking Whitaker versus Till. Again, they have it listed on Tapology that fight's going to take place at the 3 Arena in Dublin. A lot of good fighters there. That I'd like to see. And again, I'd like to see a card in Scotland. Like, you've got guys popping off right now. Stevie Ray's pretty hot commodity. Put Paul Craig on that card. Put Jojo Calderwood on that card. Lots of great stuff. Josh also asking about Jeff Neal. Jeff Neal, you're saying, where does he fit into this? I feel like nobody's talking about him. I'm talking about Jeff Neal. Matt's talking about Jeff Neal. Very, very high on Jeff Neal. He's one of those guys at 170 pounds that he's not a brawler, but he has tons of power, and it's the fact that he's so technical that he's able to beat a lot of his opponents. There are a lot of fights that I'd like to see Jeff Neal in. I think a fight against Santiago Ponzinibbio would be a fun one. I mean, if it happens. But again, you brought up some names there. Listen, Jeff Neal, Ponzinibbio sells. Jeff Neal against, I mean, maybe the winner of Cerrone and Pettis. That'd be a good one. It's tough name-wise. Also in the comment section saying, I'm eager to see Cody Garbrandt again. So talented. If he can just block those heavy, high hands, then we're good. But Cody Garbrandt's one of those guys, like, not a cautionary tale, but yeah, he just kind of got the raw end of the deal in his last 3 fights. So that's one of those ones that, yeah, it's definitely a question for sure, and we'll have to see what happens. But Cody Garbrandt, man, yeah, I'd like to see him back, because when Cody Garbrandt was on, he was on his way up. If you want to see a really, maybe not telling Cody Garbrandt fight, but one of those Garbrandt fights for sure, is the fight against Thomas Almeida. And I bet you there's a name that you haven't seen in a long time. But old Tominos, man, he was a hyped prospect. And I wish we got to see more of Thomas Almeida. But unfortunately, again, injuries to Garbrandt, especially the kidney issue. He's supposed to be taking on a Sun Tzu. That's one of those safer tests that you would assume if that fight goes the distance, not a ton of damage. But a Sun Tzu is one of those sneaky, crafty veterans. It'd be like facing Yuri Alcantara on the way up. Like, it's one of those fights that, yeah, Alcantara might leave the cage with your leg, but still, one of those guys that you can put him up against that's highly ranked, and it's a good fight for Garbrandt. So, really appreciate all the questions in the chat. We're going to have more stuff coming out this week. And, yeah, I mean, a crazy bantamweight division, a crazy lightweight division. Who knows what's going to happen between Justin Gaethje and Tony Ferguson? And some of these names that you're bringing up, like you had set up there, I mean, the Jeff Neals, Aljamain Sterling, who am I thinking of here? Corey Sandhagen, all these fighters that you might consider under the radar. If you didn't get a chance to check out our just absolute fantasy matchmaking of Grand Prix brackets, where we did all the way from flyweight to heavyweight, go back and check that out, because it's evergreen type of stuff. You can watch it whenever, and there's a lot of contenders in there that might not be in the UFC. They could be from Bellator, KSW, One Championship, some of the different promotions out there, and we're pitting them head to head. We went with random seeding, but we had the champion as number 1, and just kept clicking random to see what would happen, and a lot of fun matchups here. So make sure you check that out. Like I said as well, the Machida piece that came out yesterday, in case you missed it, MMA Legends. It's something unlike anything we've ever done with Fight Night Picks. So give me some feedback on that one. Hit up the comments below that video. Let me know what you're thinking about it. As always, you can find us on Twitter and Instagram at Craig Allen FNP, at Fight Night Picks, at Matt Allen FNP as well. And we're going to have predictions for UFC, whether it's 249, UFC 250. So make sure you check those out. And like I said, really appreciate everybody in the chat for tuning in, and we're going to have more content coming out this week, and especially those fight picks that I know everybody enjoys. So we'll see you again on the flip side, and enjoy the fights and stay safe. We'll see you later.
It's time
For 15 minutes of non-stop MMA, tackling the biggest news in the sport. Head into the chat and let us know how you feel. Live from Fredericton, New Brunswick, Canada, here's your host, Craig Allen.